All right, folks, we got there. Thanks again for your patience. So I would love to welcome Lana Brindley to the Right to Doc stage after a little delay, but I'm sure it will be worth it. So Lana is going to take us on an exploration of using AI to produce developer documentation. She's going to cover both why and how she did it, and offer some thoughts on whether or not she'd do it again. Possibly, and this is a big possibly, with a live demo, if the demo gods, generative AI and video switching plays ball with us today. After starting a new job in February, Lana tells me that she has learned far more about shipping and logistics than she ever thought she would or wanted to know. Now she's constantly surprised when a package she orders actually shows up at the door. The more you know. But today, our shipment of knowledge is within the delivery time frame, so join me in welcoming Lana Brindley.
The acronym you want there is actually DIFOT, delivered in full on time.
Oh, there you go.
So there you go, I'm just laying some logistics
The
knowledge
more
on
you know.
So I would also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of Naarm, the land on which I am giving this presentation today, and the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, where I live, work and wrote this talk. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders we have here today. I would like to acknowledge that this land, which I benefit from occupying, was stolen, and that sovereignty was never ceded. I would also like to note that I've only just started making presentations in Canva, and I might have gotten a little carried away. There is a lot of AI in this talk, and that extends to the images on the slides you're about to see. So, as you might expect, I put the abstract I had written into Gemini Advanced. So I used the prompt, this is an abstract for a talk I need to give, draft this talk for me, and I gave it the abstract that I had submitted. As you can probably imagine, Gemini didn't come up with anything particularly interesting, so I'm ignoring it. One thing it was really quite insistent about, though, is that it wanted me to open with a humorous anecdote. I thought that was a good idea. So it suggested this one from Terminator 2. I'll read it out. I remember that scene in Terminator 2 where Sarah Connor dreams about Judgment Day. Well, for us technical writers, that day might be closer than we think. ChatGPT is everywhere, and it's got us all wondering if we're about to become obsolete faster than a floppy disk. Which, aside from the fact that floppy disks didn't even go obsolete all that fast, it's actually a problem because I've not watched Terminator 2, so I don't remember any of this. So that didn't seem like a great idea. I asked it for a few more suggestions. So it could come up with a different humorous anecdote. It suggested a reference to Office Space with a non sequitur about staplers. It wants maybe a reference to The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Huge Hitchhikers fan, by the way, but this one seemed like it was a real reach. It also suggested a reference to a popular sci-fi movie other than Terminator, so helpful. And the only other suggestion it gave me was this side-splitting joke, which I'll read for you. I recently saw a headline that said robots are learning to cook, and I thought to myself, great, first they take our jobs and now they're coming for our leftovers. So if you could just pull yourselves back together after that massive belly laugh we all just had, I'm probably just going to get straight into it. So this talk has, like most stories, a beginning, a middle and an end. I'd like to start at the beginning, wander around a bit in the middle, and then finish up at the end, hopefully with some time left for questions. So if that's cool with everyone, I think we'll just get into it. Before we do get too deep into the AI side of things, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about where I work. So there's a good chance you've never heard of us. There is also a very good chance that you have possibly inadvertently interacted with us in some way. So it's one of those companies that sits quietly in the background making things happen. I like to think of it as glue work for logistics. So when you buy something online, obviously you buy it from a retailer and they use a carrier to get it to your door. So I work for a company called Ship It, and we sit in between those two. We make sure that your order gets from the retailer's website with all the appropriate packaging and documentation, is picked up by carrier and then delivered to your door. Now, the way that interaction happens can be in a number of different ways. Retailers use either the Ship It web app or they can use our APIs. But either way, we're making software talk to software. So the e-commerce or shopping cart or warehouse software needs to talk to Ship It, and then Ship It needs to go and talk to a carrier or a bunch of different carriers. Ship It supports actually over 100 carriers. Every single one of them is different. They have different rates, obviously, but they also have different service levels, which is how fast, oh, I've lost my notes. It's how fast a order gets to you. And it also has things like, interesting things like, will a person pull the order out of a truck, take it into a room of choice in your house? Or will they need a signature? Do they need to wait? Is the product on a pallet? Is it going to a warehouse? Those kinds of things. And every carrier handles these things in different ways. Of course, if you're a retailer, you don't care if Australia Post calls that Express and some other carrier calls it Next Day. We do. You just need to know, if you're a retailer, that when you need to know when your customers are going to get their order, and you need to make sure that that order turns up when you say it's going to. And that's what Ship It does, in essence. A colleague of mine recently called it automating logistics, which I loved, so I stole it. We take orders from retailers, we find a good carrier for the order based on settings that the retailer has chosen, which might be cheapest or fastest. And then we book that carrier, produce the shipping label and a manifest, and track the package through the carrier network. And that's where you might, if you were looking closely, have noticed the Ship It name when you were looking for your package. Incidentally, this has a really cool name in logistics. It's WISMO. Makes it sound a whole lot more cool than it really is. WISMO stands for Where Is My Order? And it's the bulk of all the support requests we receive. So we're not a carrier, we don't ship your actual product, but we receive all the questions about it. And this means it's the bulk of people looking for information in our documentation, asking our support staff for help, even though it's actually a long way from the core part of our business. Okay, so boring explainer out of the way, now you know who I work for. Let's launch into the fun stuff. Okay. When I joined Ship It, I spent a lot of my initial time working on the knowledge base, which is primarily aimed at people using our web interface. And what that meant is that we had a set of API docs, which were actually critically important, but that I wasn't immediately able to turn my attention to. However, that's not to say that we had no API docs at all. Ship It has a saying that we use, which is don't kick the cashew. There's a whole story there, which I won't bore you with, but it basically means if you see a job that needs doing, if you see a cashew on the floor, lean down and pick it up. Don't just wait until it gets ground into the carpet and becomes a bigger job. So if you see something needs doing, go and do it. And because of this attitude, it meant that when I joined Ship It, even though they hadn't had a technical writer before, they actually had a whole bunch of people had seen a need, they'd written documentation, and we had a huge amount of content. So a bunch of docs existed, and they were actually pretty good. As you can imagine, so this meant we had a huge amount of content, and it was, yeah, decently written, covered most of the aspects. It was just poorly organised. So as for developer documentation, we had API docs with a bunch of general developer information sort of shoehorned into it. We also had some API-related content in the knowledge base instead of on the developer center. And we also had a whole bunch of content that would have been useful for customers, but it was hidden in our internal systems, because we have a lot of internal API users as well. So the need for better developer documentation was actually pretty clear from my perspective. We really needed to be able to gather all the information we had together into one place and shoehorn some kind of structure into it. If I can put that in a slightly more professional way, we needed the content where developers could find it, in a format they could use, and in a way that fit with our other content channels. Now, I'm sure most of you are fairly familiar with this kind of thing. So, of course, I had planned to retool our API docs to include a developer guide that would allow me to bring all this stuff together. In fact, I had already put together a proof of concept for a new, quote, developer center. And so far, the place where the developer guide lived was just a big coming soon sign. So it was with some enthusiasm that I realized some stars were starting to align. The first thing was that I'd been invited to join a team that was retooling our main marketing website. And I thought it would be really cool if we could point that new website to our brand new shiny developer center. We didn't have the content for it, however, and I had no time to work on it. However, ShipFest was coming up. We do love playing on the word ship. ShipFest is essentially 2 days to work on a passion project. So if you've got a great idea for something, you pitch it to the company, others sign up to help you, and then you spend 2 days working on it, present what you did at the end. Winner gets a prize, and a huge amount of ShipFest projects have gone on to become actual ShipIt features in one way or another. And some of them are customer favorite features as well. We're just scratching our own itch, essentially. Anyway, our CTO was very excited by the new generations of large language models. He was excited about the new generation of large language models because of the increased thread capacities, which I will get back to. But I signed up to help the CTO with his LLM itch that he wanted to scratch, and I thought maybe we could throw a bunch of this developer content that we've got into an LLM, see if we can get a first pass of a developer guide. So while I appreciate that my story is just about to actually start getting interesting, I would like to take a short segue here to explain some stuff about LLMs. Now, I know we've had AI talks in the past, but I'd like to take a quick poll because I'm trying to test a theory of mine. My theory is that people fall into two camps. So you're either camp one, you've consumed everything ever about large language models through either curiosity or fear. You know everything there is to know about the impact on our industry, or you're in camp two. It's best not to know, I don't want to find out, I've actively avoided finding anything out, I'm just not interested. So who here is in camp one? The ones who know everything, excellent. And who's in camp two? We've got a few in camp two, okay. All right, camp one, feel free to pull out your phone and doom scroll for a couple minutes. Camp two, I'm talking to you. I know you don't want to know how this stuff works, but I've got you captive for the next 10 minutes, so sucked in. It's really easy to think that LLMs are like search, and I have been known to refer to them as mansplaining as a service. However, all they really are word association engines. You give them a few words, and they predict the next most likely word. Then they predict the next most likely sentence and the next most likely paragraph. The thing is, they don't do this predictably. That's what makes them sound a little bit too human sometimes. So you can ask the same question over and over and get slightly different answers every time. Now, that's not because they're human, or they're approximating human general intelligence, or any of that anthropomorphic bullshit. All they do is predict the next most likely word, and then they choose a word slightly to the left or slightly to the right of that on the bell curve. So they're not human, they're not intelligent, they aren't reading the web or learning anything from it. Now, these aren't my words, I stole them, but they're producing statistically likely word pairings, which, in most cases, produces an answer to the information that users seek. So as a result, when we talk about LLMs hallucinating, they're doing nothing of the sort. They're just picking words that are further out on the bell curve. So that means that they come up with something that is either not factual, not interesting, or not useful to us. So if you can keep this in mind when we're discussing LLMs, at least in the AI in the form of large language models specifically, not artificial general intelligence, then that's really all you need to keep in the back of your head. So thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Camp one, if you can pop your phone back down now, I'd love your attention back. So if everyone's back with us, hopefully my slides are up to date. There we go, okay. Let's get back to the story. You might recall that I said our CTO is pretty excited about the new generation of LLMs, and that's because of their thread capacities. Without wanting to get too deep in the weeds on that, it just means they can remember more stuff. So you can load them up with a whole bunch of really specific information, ask them questions about it, and they don't just almost immediately forget things, which is what some of the earlier generations were doing. So with that in mind, here is what our project looked like. We started by getting together all the docs we had. So that meant I downloaded PDF versions of the various knowledge base articles and uploaded them to the LLM, in addition to pointing the LLM to our existing API docs. Now, I think it's also important to mention what I didn't include, because it was actually quite a lot. I mentioned earlier that we had a bunch of content on our internal systems. And even though it was really relevant and it would have been really useful, and I had a good list of stuff that I had come across that I wanted to incorporate, but I chose not to include it, mostly because I didn't have the luxury of time to go through it and make sure there was no customer data or any other private data in it. I just did not have the human time to do it. So through an abundance of caution, essentially, I decided to exclude it from the data instead. Now, I'm not a prompt engineer by any standard, so I started really simple, baby steps. I uploaded the API docs alone, just on their own, and started with a simple, give me a summary of this API. And it came back with what we essentially within the organization refer to as our order workflow. So that seemed pretty good. It sort of nailed it. So let's continue. I uploaded the additional API documentation that I downloaded from the knowledge base and asked it to rewrite its response with the new information, which it did. Mostly the same, gave it a little bit more color. Because the additional documentation I'd given it was really focused on getting started things, it gave me a little bit more info about authentication, API keys, that kind of foundational information, so far so good. Next came the prompt that scares all of us tech writers. What structure would you use to write a developer guide? With the main intent here was to create a separate guide that did not currently exist and that would accompany our existing API guide, whether or not I took content out of the API guide into the developer guide. So I knew there was going to be some shuffling around of information. You might notice my anthropomorphization here. If you take the time to actually read this slide, I asked for content that the LLM might like to include. And I point that out just to say, see, we all do it. We all anthropomorphize these things. So I'm just going to pretend that didn't happen, and we'll move right along. Okay, I know you were hoping to see the LLM's response to that prompt, but I'm going to keep you guessing, because I would rather show you. So I was hoping to be able to use Gemini Advanced to query the Star Wars API and actually start developing a developer guide for it. So in the first instance, it's actually really good for just querying stuff about APIs. You can just say, tell me about this API. What does it do? One of the things I learnt during my ShipFest project was actually, it was pretty good at, I asked it, what are some common errors? And of course, it gave me all the HTTP errors. I'm like, not interested in those. What are some actual errors that might happen? And it actually created content from whole cloth, which didn't exist previously. And it gave me a list of the most common errors that people using our APIs might come across. And that has made it into the final document. So it's pretty good for actually just asking questions and drawing out those insights. And then what you can do is start drilling down. So if you were to write, oh, I saw a flicker. If you were to write a developer guide, what structure would you use? You can then use those to create your first markdown files. Within this major section, how would you structure the sections within that? And there you go, and then you've got your level 1 headings. Then you can start asking it for drafts, and drafts section by section rather than page by page or a whole guide at a time, because it loses the thread too quickly if you ask for too big stuff. So once I'd gotten from the various levels of outlines, then being able to create a draft of this section under this heading, pop that in, then do the next section. So it's a fair bit of work, and it's back and forth querying over and over, but it doesn't take you too long and you're actually starting to develop a complete set of markdown documents, which is what I did. So what I was going to do here is reference the demo I just gave you. So if we can all just pretend you saw a demo of Gemini, what we can do is see that the content it produced was fine. Yay, yay for Gemini. Gemini does create content that's fine. It's not great. It requires a whole lot of actual human braining to work out how to get it into any kind of useful or sensible format. So I'd like to dedicate the last, I'm hoping I have about 10 minutes. Thanks, Jared, I appreciate the leeway. So I'd like to dedicate the last 7.5 minutes to going through my assessment of the work that was created. So the first thing, of course, is style and language. Oh, hold on, I am actually out of whack, aren't I? I'm way out of whack. think I was going backwards and now I'm going forwards. Okay, here we are. Okay. Style and language, like I said. This is bread and butter for technical writers, and I'm not going to pretend that this part of our work is necessarily easy or enjoyable, but especially in a company that uses Australian English, it was really tedious to clean up. And also sentence case rather than title case. I think you would have seen on the earlier slides how much title case it actually uses. So I did spend a good afternoon just cleaning up what the LLM had written without actually editing anything, just getting the style right. So if nothing else, that did help me learn some of those grammatical quirks that the LLM has. If you care enough, I'll expand at length. Buy me a glass of wine. The next thing that needed doing was just expansion. LLMs are great at summary, they're not so great at detail. So adding that in the end, was weeks worth of work, and I'm still going. So there are still places, I went to add some new content the other day and found that I had a comment, write more here. So I've got a few of those still scattered around. It's like it just needs more expansion in places. So it is good to have the basics in there. It's good not to start with a blank page, but finding and writing the actual details for each API call, adding examples, all that stuff, that takes human time. The third big job was a certain level of reorganization, and I was hoping to be able to demonstrate earlier that one of the things it does a lot is create an advanced topics section, which just becomes a big bucket for all the stuff it doesn't know how to categorize. Every time I have run any kind of demo with AI or any played with it, it always comes up with this advanced topics section. And I obviously need to break that out, put it into reorganization. And the first couple of early drafts, I reorganized several times, just trying to get the flow right. So yeah, what it does give you is fine on the surface, and then on further inspection, you need a little bit more. So this bit is probably technically a segue, but I'd like to quickly discuss another non-AI tool I actually leaned on really heavily, and it's called Widdershins. It's a command line tool. You can use it to convert open API specs into Markdown. I won't go into detail unless you buy me that glass of wine and want to hear me blather on for an hour or so. The point is, I used this tool to convert our 5,000-line YAML blob into a Markdown format that I could use in a Dox's code toolchain. And it's actually pretty awesome, mostly. It got all the Markdown files sorted out. It even converted all my API schemas into proper Markdown tables. And then it took all those Markdown tables and dumped them all into a 3,000-line Markdown blob. So that was less than helpful. By then, though, I had definitely been bitten by the LLM bug, so I fired up Gemini, asked it to organize the content by API call and split it up into separate files. To which it told me all the different API calls it could find. It was less than helpful. So we argued back and forth in the Gemini interface for a while, and it either did something I hadn't asked it to do, like this, or it sort of tried, but the results were either incomplete or incorrect. So considering I was trying to work with Markdown files, I decided to switch into my editor. Like most of you, probably, I use VS Code. It has a few options for built-in LLMs in it. And I did have a little bit more success here. I eventually got somewhere by going through the original API docs for each individual API call, asking the LLM to pull out the relevant tables for that call. This was only slightly faster than doing it myself. And I discovered later on through human reading and reviewing that a whole bunch of stuff had been missed. I am still fixing it. So I basically had to now, and whenever someone says, I think there's a table missing, I have to go back through my original YAML blob, find the table, copy it across, convert it into Markdown, and that's all very much by hand. So I do not have a good solution to this problem. And so, I'd like to finish up by looking back at the experience. When we gave our ShipFest presentation at the end of the 2 days, I sort of mentioned this offhand, but I think it's actually a decent framing. So would I hire Gemini as a trainee technical writer? So using an LLM for this work provided a really good starting point. And I have been using it as a starting point for a lot more of my content since this initial experiment. especially actually knowledge-based content over and above developer content. It's not great. I discard probably 98% or more of what it gives me, but it's good for getting from blank page to writing. And I do think it's valuable just for that alone. I get started a lot faster now than I used to. I'm also not the first to notice this, but it's pretty good at taking large amounts of content and summarizing, condensing, developing an initial outline, that kind of thing. It's not perfect, not by a long way, but it does have the advantage of being quick, or at least quicker than I am to do it. So much quicker than I can do it myself. One thing I did find it handy for that I haven't mentioned so far is things like the boring stuff in my editor. So like if you need to remove the third column from a 6-column table, that's just boring, stultifying work and we all hate it. You can get your LLM to do it, but it's not consistent, so you need to check its work. And honestly, I think I spent just as much time checking its work as I would have actually removing that column myself. But doing the job of checking was more entertaining and interesting than removing all those pipe characters, so I figure it's actually a win. With that in mind, it's important to note the inconsistencies. Some things it did okay at, and some things it really sucked at. And the things that it sucked at ended up being massive time sinks. So there's a point where you find yourself sort of an hour in arguing with a computer and you realise you could have done it already by now. And because we're humans and not robots, it's actually hard to know when you're in the middle of a sunk cost fallacy until it's a bit too late. So the real thing that I wanted to mention here is that even the things that it's good at, it's not consistently good at. You really do need to double check its work every single time. So to answer the question, would I hire an LLM as a trainee technical writer? No, I would not. I've had trainees who were significantly better than this and at least capable of learning and improvement. On the other hand, would I hire an LLM as an unpaid high school student on work experience? Yeah, maybe. They'll screw things up 5 times out of 10. They need constant supervision. They need a whole lot of additional work to make their output useful. And you're not going to get anything more than that out of them, ever. So at some point, the LLM, like the work experience student, will probably go back to school, become a software developer or project manager or something. And if I'm reading the tea leaves correctly, this may well be the pinnacle of artificial general intelligence, at least in our lifetimes. I don't think we need to be afraid for our jobs at all. I do think that we need to know what tools we have available to us. And if you have a free work experience kit, I say take it. So thank you so much for your time. I apologise for the technical hitches and the lack of demo. I will do my very best to sound intelligent if you ask me some questions, and I am serious about buying me wine if you want to know more.
Very good. Thank you, Lana. While we are doing the question and answers, we are going to bump over to the next set of slides up at the booth. So you might see some screen changes happening.
You don't want Cyberpunk AI version of me.
I mean, it does look pretty cool.
It does.
I'm not going to lie.
Make sure you grab that QR code if you're interested in roles that ship it, by the way, just before it disappears. So it's caught up in the corner there and you may not notice it.
Yes. Scan it now. All right. We are going for questions right here on the edge here.
So you mentioned you'd be fine with hiring it as a free
One that
volunteer.
I didn't have to pay for, yes.
AI, even if you're not paying for it, isn't free. There's like a massive energy footprint to this. There's, the cost of companies looking at AI being like, oh, this balloons our share price and then we can lay off a bunch of people and keep ballooning our share price and all this sort of stuff. I understand this is more of an experiment in like seeing how this works for you. Were the outcomes that came from this encouraging your company to continue down the AI path, or is this something that they've reflected on and said, this isn't for us yet? What sort of outcomes have actually sort of stemmed from this? And
it's a good question. I didn't dive into it because I'm not sure ShipIt actually has a stated position on this yet. They've been very cautious so far. For example, most of the marketing team, which included me as an adjunct to the marketing team, everyone who handled content, we recently did a copywriting course that talked about using AI for copywriting and SEO and that kind of stuff. So they're being quite cautious, but they are investigating it. And that's why this kind of project is welcomed and used. As for, yes, there is an extreme cost to AI in terms of the environment and compute and all the rest of it, but as I alluded to earlier, if I'm reading the tea leaves correctly, it's probably all going to implode on itself fairly soon anyway. I am not anticipating that it's going to continue at the rate of growth that the AI tech bros tell us it's going to.
Yeah, I think you're probably right there. I'm looking for another question while we're just getting things set up. I'm going to go to that question there, Giles, and then I'm going to go over to the right here.
Yeah, I'm just curious to know, this may sort of been out of your scope, but have you tried using the tools on different types of content? Like, I know it's been mostly API related content, but maybe less, if there was any like less technical content that you may have tried Gemini against, you know, you're able to sort of elaborate a bit on that, if you have.
Yeah, so I did use it for the developer guide in the first place, but actually what I'm using it for most day-to-day is knowledge-based content now, especially package receiver content. I told you this is the bulk of the content that we receive, the bulk of the content that we need to develop and get asked for a lot, but it's not the core of our business. And so being able to, like I think one I did recently was an article about making, like, what happens if I get a delivery and I've got pets at home. And I say, oh my gosh, I could sit here and think up all the different ways you can lock up your pet and you can train them better and all this kind of thing. Or I could ask Gemini to do it, so I did. Like I said, I threw away 98% of what it wrote. I actually ended up writing the article myself. But that idea generation piece is actually really useful for, especially for that kind of content that I'm certainly no expert in. We've recently launched an international product which has required a huge amount of content because as logistics experts we need to be able to tell people how to handle international shipping, which is in itself very complicated. So I've been learning a lot about international shipping, but I'm also then able to go, oh hey, can you tell me what the most commonly used Incoterms are? I didn't even know what an Incoterm was a month ago. So being able to not just have it explain what an Incoterm is, but then to be able to explain the most common one, the most commonly used one, so I can then use that that's the basis for an article that people will actually find useful. So yeah, I do use it quite a lot for less API and developer content these days.
I know one thing that I, just as a personal anecdote, I've actually really found useful is how Jira lets you re-summarize your Jira descriptions. Honestly, that's the hardest thing to do, and it really helps. It's just, it makes them much better than I write them. So
well, we do say a lot of like user research and that kind of thing. And so if you've got an hour call with customer, asking them all about how they use the product, then we use the transcript and can summarize that and actually pull out the dot points from it and actually get some actionable work out of it. So that kind of thing it's really good for.
It's really good at doing those really well-defined tasks.
Yeah.
I'm looking for one more question. Should we have time for one more, Swapnil? Yep. One more question if we got one. Yep, over there, in the side there. Jay?
Yeah, you mentioned that there was that trap where you maybe work for an hour and realise sunk costs are maybe higher than just doing it. I was wondering if you think if these LLMs do over the next 5 or 10 years get more advanced, will that trap get worse because the initial impression is better, but the problems in there are still as bad as now?
I appreciate where your question's going, and I don't think I'm answering the right question, but I don't believe they're going to get that much better. So it's sort of a bit of a how long is a piece of string. I mean, if we get artificial general intelligence, which I mean is not going to happen, but if we did, then that's a completely different ballgame. As far as large language models go, they're already running into training problems. There's not enough content to train them. They're already trained on the entirety of the content in the world. So they're not going to get better. As far as that trap goes, yeah, it's just hard to tell because we're human. My partner will quite happily tell you there are days where I've just been head down arguing with Gemini just to try and get it to produce something that's useful or interesting to me. And then it's like an hour later, it's like, oh my God, I could have just done it. So why didn't I just do it? So yeah, it just happens a lot. And I think it's just the nature of being human.
Okay, I think that might have been the end of the question session. Look, folks, just take a few moments to thank Lana. And thank you, Lana, for putting up with the tech problems that we've thrown at you with absolute aplomb. Amazing.
So thank you for dealing with no demo and my random description of what the demo may have possibly been. If anyone would like a demo, I'm happy to fire up Gemini Advanced in the hallway or something.
I don't know. It seemed like pretty good alt text to me. Like,
Alt text is the best I can do.